But it's not to say maybe we're missing the question. But on the military, at the end of the day, they're quite precious about their networks, as we know. Having said that, if there's fiber out that way, it gives an opportunity to extend it further. All right, but again, you know, we sometimes try to simplify very complex things. And one thing I will disagree with Barry is all fiber isn't created alike. There are very different generations of fiber that's out there, and the electronics on them are all very, very, very different. And you have to change electronics if you want to, you know, push the speeds. You know, as Chris said, you know, we are providing a whole range of services from 8 meg to multi-gigabit services for business, and based on an infrastructure that will continue to grow as long as you can continue to swap out the electronics and put faster speed electronics on it. So the fact of the matter is, though, all these things should be explored, and that's one of the promises we made to Rory. Because, as I said, we're in this phase. We know what we can do, but that will only be part of the solution. We might need to work with some wireless providers. We might need to do some other things. At the end of the day, you know, the English region that Aidan referred to is going to have 85–90% fiber coverage. And it's a very deep penetration of fiber, from, you know, compared to anybody in the world.
Thank you very much. So just bring in Malcolm Corbett from Inca.
Thank you very much, Malcolm Corbett, Inca. I wanted to ask a question of the providers on the panel, which is, given the scale of costs and the difficulty of doing this, there have been examples from around the world of communities themselves, not least in this country, who've got together in order to make something happen, pooling investments, etc. If we were to start creating community investment schemes, where we as citizens and consumers, who are going to pay for it in the end anyway, start bringing together some of the investment, would you guys be prepared to share some of the ownership and some of the longer-term economic benefits that derive from building out these networks? In other words, we pull in the money as consumers on community, you know, some sort of community share ownership schemes, as some people are planning right now. Would you play ball?
One second, we're just going to bring in one more question from Caldbeck.
Thank you. Jim Cox from the Commission for Rural Communities. Just a question on including Carlisle in the BT bid. The danger of including a centre of population in a bid that's going to be based with a denominator on the population is that the people in Carlisle will be provided and the people in the more remote rural areas won't be included. What's the response to that, and why is Carlisle being included?
And we'll pull in, since I happen to be here, one more man.
So Matthew Hare from Community Internet Group. If we could persuade the government to change their plan to invest £20 billion in upgrading the West Coast main line, that's going to take 22 minutes off the journey time, and instead spend that 20 billion over the next 3 years in upgrading the fibre network across the country, what's the best way to spend the money?
There's a real competition, as you can imagine, at the moment going on how to work out how to re-spend government money. I spent the whole of yesterday with everybody saying, if we can save £9 billion a year on Afghanistan, can't we buy some more aircraft carriers? So this is a variation thing. I guess maybe bring in a couple of the panelists who haven't had a chance to speak, so maybe Gio and then Barry.
Okay, thanks very much. I mean, I'll try and address, I'll leave question number 2 to Bill, because obviously their piece of work, but question 1 and 3 there. I think ultimately come down to a similar challenge. Whether you're putting the money in from, if you like, the bottom, from the community, or whether you're doing it from the top through central government. And I agree, you know, when you see sums of money like that spent on individual projects, and you think about the amount of angst and discussions going on in rooms like this all over the country, it does make you pause for thought about the prioritisation of what's happening here, and why perhaps we aren't taking a centrally led approach, as they are doing in other countries around the world. If we look at, there are different approaches being made in different countries, but a good example of an alternative approach is the one that they're taking in New Zealand, where the national government has decided to spend a similar proportion, I think relative to its GDP, on a similar problem, a very rural, lots of rural countryside, and broadband. And they've decided that fibre is the solution, and that in order to roll that out extensively, but to avoid some of the jeopardy of investment being stranded or in the hands of too few people who do not have a commercial interest to make it available to the market, they've decided to restructure the market at the same time. Now, this is big stuff, and it's a big bet that they're taking about a model, but effectively they're saying the infrastructure that goes in, and this wouldn't matter whether it came from a community, a village putting together, or whether it was a national project, but fundamentally, whoever has put that money in needs to be in partnership, in a venture, an actual company, that will only have an interest in getting the best out of that asset for its citizens. And in order to make sure that it's not just locked in for one organisation into the future, that organisation won't be allowed to go and sell services to retail users, to people like yourselves, to businesses and others. It will sell instead to any service provider that wants it on exactly the same terms. You don't need to regulate it, because you've got a business that just simply wants to say, come and use my infrastructure now, and as it needs to be upgraded into the future with new technology all the way through. That infrastructure model is not how our industry is typically structured today, where organisations get a network, build a platform on it, and then offer services out. So I would commend that to all of you, and commend it to anybody in government thinking about a way of solving this problem and avoiding the jeopardies that come from whether you put the money in the bottom or the top. There's a new structure that could be used. They're adopting it in New Zealand. They're spending billions of their currency and New Zealand dollars on it. They're creating 33 local fibre companies who will then roll out fibre and offer it to service providers who for generations will continue to use that fibre, because we in the industry all know that that will be a useful investment. The way they use it in 5 years' time will change from how it's used now. But it's a really interesting model, and I think it answers both those points.
Can I quickly bring in Barry then?
I just wanted to make
yeah,
one
already,
point.
quickly, yeah.
I contributed to some of the New Zealand policy.
Richard. Barry, yeah.
Yes, some very interesting points have been raised there. I think the thing I'd like to focus back on, though, is the fact that what we're really interested in is the last 30%, and there's been all this discussion about markets and telcos and different people providing things, but we know that when you get down to the sparsely populated last 20%, 30%, whatever it is very difficult to make a business case for investment, and it's in that sort of area that I believe we need public intervention, which can be in two forms. I mean, it can be in the form of central government funding or local government funding, but it can also be contributions from the community themselves, either in terms of cash or in terms of effort.
Yes.
So you mustn't forget that the local communities can do a lot. I think one of the things we need to make sure of is where we do put any money in that is public money, that's taxpayers' money, that is your money, that it doesn't simply provide alternative funding to what telcos would have done, BT or anybody else. So we need to make sure that any subsidies that we do apply are very targeted to make sure they're not simply displacing other investment, which is what I even said to some extent. We don't want to perturb the market. And I think some of the interventions we've seen so far have been a bit that way inclined. You look at them and think, well, hang on a minute, they probably would have done that anyway. You know, why did we put a whole lot of money into it? The last point I'd make is that where we do intervene, where we do use public money, where the community does do anything, we need to go for long-term solutions. So we need to do something that isn't a sticking plaster solution, but is something that's got future. And I absolutely agree with what Jeff said. Whatever we put in, it needs to be open access, it needs to be technology compatible, so that anybody who wishes to run services over it can run services over it.
All right, thank you. So we're going to now move towards conclusion so everyone can have some lunch. We're going to give all the speakers a chance to reply to the last set of questions. We'll run upstairs here.
Thank you. It's Dave Donford from Small World Cable. We're the incumbent cable operator in Carlisle and in fact up through the borders. And many, many years ago there was actually a plan to invest about £330 million in cabling out to Workington and Whitehaven and so on. And we did spend over £20 million in fibring up